Commander Riley Martinez had been dead for 8 years. Well, officially dead. In reality, she was very much alive and making the worst coffee in 3-star systems at Galaxy grounds on Space Station Delta 7, which, considering her customers were aliens who couldn't taste half the compounds in coffee anyway, was really saying something. One large nebula blend. Extra foam, she muttered, pushing the steaming cup across the counter to a Rigelian whose idea of a compliment was not immediately spitting it back in her face. The alien's translation device chirped something that probably meant thank you but sounded suspiciously like "this tastes like engine coolant." Riley had heard worse. Mostly from herself every morning when she taste tested her own product. 8 years ago she'd been Commander Riley Ace Martinez, the ghost of Proxima, terror of the Vex Armada and holder of more flight records than she could count. Now she was Riley Martinez, interstellar beverage specialist, whose biggest achievement was remembering to clean the espresso machine without being reminded. The fake identification papers she'd bought from a very expensive forger on Kepler Station listed her previous experience as customer service and beverage preparation. What they didn't mention was that her idea of customer service used to involve flying a fighter ship through impossible odds, and her beverage preparation consisted of military ration packets and whatever didn't freeze in the cockpit. Riley, the thermal regulator is making that noise again, called Blep from behind the pastry display. Blep was a Zorgonian with 4 arms, which you'd think would make him incredibly efficient at coffee shop work. You'd be wrong. Blep had somehow managed to burn water last Tuesday. Not boil it, burn it. Riley was still trying to figure out the physics of that particular disaster. Which noise? Riley asked, though she already knew. The thermal regulator made 17 different concerning sounds, and she'd learned to identify each one like a pilot reading engine diagnostics. The clicking, the grinding, or the one that sounds like a dying space whale. The whale one. That's normal. It does that when the station's artificial gravity fluctuates. Nothing explodes unless it starts harmonizing with itself. Blep's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, which Riley had learned meant he was confused but didn't want to admit it. How do you know so much about machinery? Riley paused mid-grind. 8 years of practice had made her careful about these moments. You pick things up when you work in customer service long enough. Lots of different equipment to learn. It wasn't technically a lie. Fighter ships had lots of equipment. And she'd definitely learned about all of it, usually while it was being shot at by hostile aliens trying to turn her into space dust. The morning rush continued with its usual parade of beings who had no business operating complex machinery but somehow managed to pilot spacecraft across the galaxy. There was Glix, a Sendorian trader who always ordered the same drink but pronounced it differently every time. And Commander Torque from the station's laughably small defense force who liked his coffee black and his military briefings even blacker. Any word on those Vex sightings in the Outer Rim? Torque asked, accepting his cup with the resignation of someone who knew the coffee was terrible but needed the caffeine anyway. Riley's hand tightened imperceptibly on the grinder handle. Vex, I thought they'd been quiet since the war ended. Mostly. But there's been some chatter. Probably nothing. Torque shrugged with the confidence of someone whose idea of a major military crisis was running out of donuts in the break room. Even if something did happen, we've got 3 defense shuttles and pilots who've actually read the manual. What could go wrong? Riley managed not to snort coffee through her nose, but it was a close thing. She'd seen the station's defense pilots. Calling them pilots was like calling a house fire a controlled burn. They were enthusiastic, she'd give them that. But enthusiasm didn't make up for the fact that most of them thought evasive maneuvers meant flying in a straight line but really, really fast. I'm sure everything will be fine, she said, which was the kind of thing you said when you didn't want to explain that you'd single-handedly destroyed more Vex ships than the entire station defense force had probably seen in their combined careers. As Torque left, Riley caught her reflection in the polished surface of the espresso machine. 8 years of hiding had been good to her. No more stress lines from wondering if today would be the day her luck ran out. No more nightmares about the things she'd seen in the war. No more responsibility for keeping entire star systems safe from extinction. Just terrible coffee and the occasional burned water incident. It was, she had to admit, a pretty good retirement. Even if nobody knew she was retired from being one of the most dangerous humans in the galaxy. Riley was in the middle of explaining to a confused Altarian customer that no, they could not substitute antimatter for sugar in their latte, when the first explosion rattled the station hard enough to knock over the tip jar. "Attention all station personnel," crackled the intercom in Station Commander Webb's voice, which had gone up about 3 octaves since this morning. "We are experiencing a minor technical difficulty with some uninvited guests. Please remain calm and continue with your normal activities." Through the coffee shop's viewport, Riley could see what Webb generously called uninvited guests. 3 massive Vex dreadnoughts hung in space like mechanical vultures, their hulls bristling with enough firepower to crack a moon. Behind them smaller fighter craft swarmed like angry insects. "Oh, that's not good," Blep observed, managing to drop a tray of pastries with 2 of his arms while pointing at the ships with the other 2. "Those are the bad aliens, right?" "Depends on your perspective," Riley said, continuing to grind coffee beans because stopping would mean acknowledging that her peaceful retirement was about to become significantly less peaceful. "From their point of view, we're probably the bad aliens." The station shuddered again as the Vex opened fire on the outer shields. Riley watched through the viewport as the station's 3 defense shuttles launched to meet them. She'd seen military parades with more intimidating formations. "Brave little guys," she muttered, watching the shuttles spread out in what she generously assumed was meant to be an attack formation. "Stupid but brave." The lead shuttle, piloted by someone Riley vaguely recognized from the morning coffee rush, immediately flew straight at the nearest dreadnought in what tactical manuals would politely call an aggressive frontal assault, and anyone with half a brain would call suicide with extra steps. "Oh no," Riley said, grinding coffee beans with unnecessary force. "No, no, no, you don't charge a dreadnought head-on. That's not how physics works. That's not how any of this works." The shuttle managed to fire exactly 1 shot before a Vex fighter swatted it aside like a particularly slow fly. The pilot ejected, which Riley supposed counted as tactical thinking, if you defined tactical thinking as not dying immediately. "Riley, should we be worried?" asked Mrs. Krell, an elderly Centaurian, who came in every day for tea and gossip. She was peering out the viewport with the kind of calm curiosity that suggested she'd lived through worse things than alien invasions. "Oh, I'm sure it'll be fine," Riley lied, watching the second shuttle attempt what looked like an evasive maneuver but was actually just flying in circles until it got dizzy and crashed into an asteroid. "Our defense force has everything under control." The third shuttle lasted almost 30 seconds, which Riley had to admit was longer than she'd expected. The pilot even managed to scratch the paint on one of the Vex fighters before a plasma cannon turned the shuttle into a brief bright flower of expanding gas and metal fragments. "Attention all personnel," came Webb's voice again, now hitting notes that could probably shatter crystal. "We are upgrading our situation from minor technical difficulty to moderate inconvenience. Please continue to remain calm while we explore alternative solutions to our current predicament." Riley watched a Vex boarding craft detach from one of the dreadnoughts and head straight for the station's main docking bay. Alternative solutions. Right. She could think of several alternative solutions, most of which involved tactics the Vex wouldn't see coming because they required the kind of creative thinking that came from being raised on a planet where the local wildlife actively tried to kill you. But those solutions would require her to stop being Riley Martinez, interstellar beverage specialist, and go back to being Commander Riley Ace Martinez, the ghost of Proxima. And she'd worked very hard to bury that person. "You know," said Blep, watching the Vex fighters establish a perimeter around the station, "I'm starting to think those pilots didn't actually read the manual." Riley snorted despite herself. "What gave you that impression? The part where they flew directly into enemy fire, or the part where they forgot that space has 3 dimensions?" "The spinning," Blep said thoughtfully. "There was a lot of unnecessary spinning." "That wasn't a tactical maneuver," Riley explained, still grinding coffee beans that were now approaching powder consistency. "That was panic. When most species panic in a spacecraft, they either freeze up completely or start spinning. Humans are weird because we panic by getting creative." "How do you know so much about space combat?" Mrs. Krell asked, raising one elegantly feathered eyebrow. Riley realized she'd been talking too much again. 8 years of keeping her mouth shut, and she was going to blow her cover because she couldn't resist critiquing bad flying. I watch a lot of documentaries. Very educational, you learn things." Another explosion shook the station, this one close enough to rattle the coffee cups. Through the intercom, Riley could hear what sounded like running feet and muffled shouting in several languages, none of which sounded particularly optimistic. "Attention all station personnel," Webb's voice crackled again, now approaching frequencies normally reserved for emergency distress beacons. "We are currently seeking anyone, and I mean anyone, with even basic piloting experience. Advanced piloting experience preferred, but at this point we'll take someone who successfully operated a personal transport without crashing into anything important." Riley kept grinding coffee beans. She was not going to respond to that announcement. She was retired. She made coffee now. Bad coffee, but coffee nonetheless. Heroes belonged in the past, and the past was a place she'd worked very hard to leave behind. Even if watching incompetent pilots get shot down was making her twitch with the kind of professional frustration that came from knowing exactly how to fix a problem but not being able to do anything about it. Riley was pouring what might charitably have been called a cappuccino when the coffee shop door burst open with enough force to rattle the pastry display. Captain Voss of the Centaurian Defense Corps strode in, his normally pristine uniform torn, and his feathers singed from what looked like close contact with an explosion. "We need every pilot we can find," he announced to the coffee shop at large, which currently consisted of Riley, Blepp, Mrs. Krell, and a Betelgeusian accountant, who was trying very hard to pretend he wasn't there. "The Vex have broken through our outer defenses, and we're down to harsh language and strongly worded diplomatic protests." "Have you tried coffee?" Riley asked, because it seemed like the kind of thing a barista would say in this situation. "I hear caffeine helps with decision-making." Voss fixed her with the kind of stare that suggested he was not in the mood for beverage-related humor. "This is serious. Those are Vex dreadnoughts out there, and they're not here for a social visit. We need someone who knows how to fly something more complex than a cargo hauler." Riley nodded sympathetically while continuing to foam milk that was probably going to taste like industrial lubricant. "That does sound challenging. I'm sure you'll figure something out." "Figure something out?" Voss's voice cracked slightly. "Half our defense force is floating in escape pods, the other half is trying to surrender in languages the Vex don't speak, and our best tactical officer is currently hiding in a supply closet, claiming he's taking inventory. Maybe try the cantina on level 7, Riley suggested. Pilots hang out there sometimes, you know, off-duty types who might be willing to help." Voss stared at her for a long moment, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he was thinking about something. Something that was making Riley increasingly uncomfortable. "You know," he said slowly, "you look familiar." Riley's hand tightened on the milk steamer. "I have one of those faces, very generic. Human standard template, you might say." "No, it's more than that." Voss pulled out a tablet and started scrolling through what looked like military files. "The way you move, the way you talk about tactics like you actually understand them. And earlier, when you were explaining combat psychology, you sounded like someone who'd actually seen combat." "I watch a lot of documentaries," Riley repeated, but her voice had gone flat in the way it used to when she was about to do something that would probably get her court-martialed. "Riley Martinez," Voss read from his tablet, and Riley's blood turned to ice water. "Age 32, supposedly from Earth's agricultural colonies, employment history and food service dating back 8 years. He looked up at her with the kind of smile that wasn't actually a smile. "Funny thing about that employment history, it starts exactly 8 years ago, nothing before that. It's almost like someone just appeared out of thin air." Riley set down the milk steamer very carefully. "People start new careers all the time. Career changes are very common these days. You want to know what else is interesting?" Voss continued, clearly enjoying himself now. 8 years ago, Commander Riley Martinez of the Human Defense Corps disappeared after the Battle of Proxima Centauri. Officially listed as killed in action, but her body was never recovered. They called her the Ghost of Proxima because she had this habit of appearing out of nowhere and making entire Vex squadrons disappear. The coffee shop had gone very quiet. Even Blepp had stopped whatever he was doing with his forearms to stare at Riley with all 4 eyes. "That's a very interesting story," Riley said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "But I think you have me confused with someone else. I make coffee. Very bad coffee, but coffee nonetheless." Voss turned his tablet around so everyone could see the screen. It showed a military photograph of a woman in a Human Defense Corps uniform, younger and harder looking than the current Riley, but unmistakably the same person. The uniform was covered with enough decorations to stock a small jewelry store. "Commander Riley Aces Martinez," Voss announced to the coffee shop. "Hero of the Proxima campaign, single-handedly destroyed the Vex supercarrier Inevitable Conquest using a damaged fighter and what her after-action report described as aggressive improvisation and excessive stubbornness." Mrs. Krell dropped her teacup. The Betelgeusian accountant made a noise that sounded like a deflating balloon. Blepp's 4 eyes somehow managed to get even wider. Riley looked around at the faces staring at her and realized her cover wasn't just blown, it had been atomized. "Okay," she said finally. "That might be me. Might be." Voss's feathers were practically standing on end with excitement. "You're the Ghost of Proxima, you're a legend. They teach courses about your tactics at the military academy." "They really shouldn't," Riley muttered, because some of those tactics had involved things that were technically violations of several interstellar treaties. "Most of what I did was make it up as I went along and hope it worked. It worked well enough to end the war," Voss said. "And right now, we need someone who can do it again." Riley looked around the coffee shop one more time. At Blepp, who was still staring at her like she'd just announced she was secretly a mythical creature. At Mrs. Krell, who was nodding approvingly as if this explained why her coffee always tasted like someone had forgotten how coffee was supposed to work. At the Betelgeusian accountant, who had decided that now was a good time to quietly edge toward the exit. "I'm retired," she said finally. "I make coffee now. Bad coffee, but it's honest work and nobody shoots at me." "The Vex are boarding the station as we speak," Voss said. "In about 20 minutes, they're going to turn this place into scrap metal and everyone on it into very small pieces, including your coffee shop." Riley sighed and looked down at the cappuccino she'd been making. The foam had settled into something that looked like a small depressed cloud. "I really hate it when my past catches up with me," she said. "Absolutely not," Riley said, backing away from Voss with her hands raised. "I don't care if the station is about to become space debris. I'm retired. Do you know what retired means? It means I don't do the hero thing anymore." "But you're the ghost of Proxima," Voss insisted, following her around the counter. "You're practically a living legend." "Legends belong in museums, not cockpits," Riley shot back. "Besides, it's been 8 years. I'm rusty. My reflexes are shot. I probably can't even remember which button fires the weapons and which one ejects the pilot." "It's like riding a bicycle," Voss said confidently. "Bicycles don't explode when you make a mistake," Riley pointed out. "And they don't have hostile aliens shooting at them with plasma cannons." The station shuddered again, this time hard enough to knock several coffee cups off their shelves. Through the viewport, Riley could see Vex boarding pods attaching to the station's hull like mechanical leeches. "Please," Mrs. Krell said quietly. "My granddaughter is visiting from the inner colonies. She's only 12. Riley closed her eyes and counted to 10 in 3 different languages, including one she'd learned from a Vex prisoner who had been surprisingly polite about the whole capture situation. When she opened them again, everyone in the coffee shop was staring at her with expressions ranging from hopeful to desperately terrified. "Fine," she said finally. "But I want it on record that this is a terrible idea, and I'm only doing it because retirement is boring and I miss the adrenaline rush of almost dying on a regular basis." 20 minutes later, Riley found herself being dragged through the station's corridors by Voss and a hastily assembled escort of security personnel who seemed to think she might try to escape. Which, to be fair, she had considered doing at least 3 times. "The hangar is just ahead," Voss said, practically bouncing with excitement. "We've prepared our best ship for you." "Define best," Riley said, because 8 years of hiding had not dulled her instincts for identifying potential disasters. They rounded the corner into Hangar Bay 7. And Riley stopped dead in her tracks. Sitting in the middle of the bay like a mechanical insult to everything she'd ever learned about spacecraft design was what looked like a fighter that had been assembled by someone who had heard about fighters secondhand and decided to improve on the concept. "That's your best ship?" Riley asked. "The Cosmic Disaster," Voss announced proudly. "She's been fully refurbished." Riley walked around the ship, taking in details that got progressively more concerning. The hull showed clear signs of repeated patch jobs. The engines looked like they'd been salvaged from 3 different manufacturers, and someone had apparently decided that duct tape was an acceptable substitute for actual welding. "When you say refurbished," Riley said carefully, "do you mean repaired, or do you mean held together with hope and industrial adhesive?" "Both," said a cheerful voice from behind the ship. A young Flarian bounced out from behind the landing gear, covered in grease and radiating the kind of enthusiasm that suggested either complete ignorance or complete insanity. "Hi, I'm Pip. I'm your weapons officer." Riley stared at the alien, who couldn't have been more than 20 in standard years and looked like they'd gotten their military training from adventure holodramas. "My weapons officer, technically, I'm still in training," Pip admitted, "but I've read all the manuals. Well, most of them, the important parts, anyway. The parts about not shooting our own ship." "That's reassuring," Riley said flatly. "What's your combat experience? Does Flight Simulator count?" "No, then none. But I did place 3rd in my class at the academy." "How many people were in your class?" 4. Riley looked at Voss. "You're sending me into combat with a ship held together by duct tape and a weapons officer, whose main qualification is not finishing last in a class of 4 people." "It's what we have," Voss said defensively. "And you're the ghost of Proxima. You once destroyed an entire Vex squadron using a cargo hauler and a shipment of decorative crystals." "That was different," Riley protested. "That was desperation and pure luck." "Well, we're desperate, and hopefully you still have some luck left." Riley walked around to the ship's cockpit and peered inside. The interior looked like someone had taken a standard fighter layout and then rearranged it according to a diagram drawn by a particularly creative child. Half the controls were labeled in languages she didn't recognize, and the other half weren't labeled at all. "Does anything in here actually work?" she asked. "Most of it," Pip said helpfully. The engines are good, the weapons are mostly functional, and the life support has only failed twice this month. What about navigation? We have a compass. A compass. In space. It points toward the nearest star. Very helpful for not getting lost. Riley pressed her forehead against the cockpit canopy and wondered if it was too late to go back to making terrible coffee. At least when coffee exploded, it just made a mess. It didn't turn you into a brief bright cloud of superheated gas. Okay, she said finally. But when this goes horribly wrong and we all die in a spectacular fireball, I want everyone to remember that I tried to retire gracefully. She climbed into the cockpit, noting that the pilot's seat had been repaired with what looked like upholstery from a diner booth. The control stick felt loose in her hand, and when she tested the throttle, it made a noise like a mechanical cat with indigestion. Pip, strap yourself in, she called, and maybe say a prayer to whatever deity your species believes in, preferably one with a sense of humor, because we're about to need all the cosmic irony we can get. As the hangar doors opened to reveal the star-filled void beyond, Riley realized that retirement really was overrated, terrifying and potentially fatal, but definitely not boring. The cosmic disaster cleared the hangar with all the grace of a brick learning to fly. Riley had forgotten how much she hated the first few seconds of launch, when you went from the safety of artificial gravity to the terrifying freedom of space where every direction was down and physics had strong opinions about your life choices. Okay, Pip, she said, wrestling with controls that seemed to have been designed by someone who'd never actually seen a human before. Status report. What are we working with? Weapons are online, Pip reported with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just been handed the keys to a candy store. We've got plasma cannons, missile pods, and something called a reality distortion field that I'm afraid to ask about. Don't touch that last one, Riley said quickly. Reality distortion fields are either complete nonsense or weapons of mass destruction, and I don't want to find out which. Through the cockpit, she could see the Vex formation spread out like a mechanical constellation, 3 dreadnoughts in the center, surrounded by at least 40 fighter craft, all of them moving in the kind of precise formation that spoke of military discipline and complete confidence in their technological superiority. They're not even trying to hide, Riley muttered, banking left to avoid a piece of debris that used to be one of the station's defense shuttles. Look at that formation. It's textbook perfect. Absolutely no creativity whatsoever. Is that bad? Pip asked. For them? Yes. Predictable enemies are the best kind of enemies. Riley checked her instruments and immediately regretted it. Half of them were flashing red, the other half weren't working at all, and one appeared to be displaying what looked like a recipe for pasta salad. Pip, please tell me our targeting system works. Mostly. Sometimes it locks onto our own ship, but I've learned to work around that. Fantastic. Okay, here's the plan. We're going to do something so stupid and reckless that it violates several laws of physics and at least one galactic treaty on sensible military conduct. Riley pushed the throttle forward, and the cosmic disaster responded with a sound like a mechanical hiccup. The ship lurched toward the Vex formation with all the subtlety of a caffeinated rhinoceros. Shouldn't we be more sneaky? Pip asked, as plasma fire started lighting up the space around them. Sneaky is for people with functional cloaking devices, Riley replied, throwing the ship into a spiral that would have been impressive if it had been intentional. We're going to use the ancient human tactical doctrine of confuse the enemy by doing things that make no sense. She dove straight toward the nearest dreadnought, watching the Vex fighters scramble to intercept. Their formation was breaking apart as they tried to adjust to her completely irrational approach vector. Pip, fire everything at the lead fighter, she ordered. Which one is the lead fighter? The one that looks most confident. Pip's weapons barrage lit up the void, and to everyone's surprise, including Riley's, actually hit something. The Vex fighter exploded in a shower of sparks and debris, mostly because it had been flying in such a predictable pattern that even accidentally functional weapons could nail it. I got one, Pip shouted with the kind of joy normally reserved for small children who just learned to ride a bicycle. Don't celebrate yet, Riley warned, pulling the ship into a turn that made the engines scream in protest. We've still got 39 more to go, and they're starting to get annoyed. The Vex fighters were regrouping, forming attack patterns that would have been impressive if Riley hadn't seen them all before. The problem with fighting an enemy for 8 years was that you learned their playbook, and the Vex hadn't updated their tactics since the war ended. They're trying to box us in, she observed, watching the fighters move into a classic encirclement maneuver. Standard Vex tactic number 4. I used to counter this by doing something completely insane. What did you do? Pip asked. I flew directly at the biggest ship and hoped they'd get confused enough to shoot each other. Riley pointed the cosmic disaster at the nearest dreadnought and pushed the throttle as far forward as it would go. The ship responded with a noise that suggested it was questioning her life choices, but it accelerated anyway. This is insane, Pip said, watching the dreadnought grow larger in the viewport. That's the point, Riley replied. Insanity is the one thing military academies don't teach you how to counter. The Vex fighters were trying to follow her, but their formations were designed for fighting sensible enemies, who did sensible things like maintaining safe distances and following established tactical doctrine. Riley was doing the space combat equivalent of running into a formal dinner party while juggling flaming torches and shouting, "Pip, hit the disco lights," she ordered. "We have disco lights." Third panel from the left, the button that looks like a small sun. Pip pressed the button, and the cosmic disaster suddenly lit up like a hyperactive Christmas tree. Multicolored strobe lights erupted from every surface, turning the ship into a flying dance party that was visible from 3-star systems away. "Why do we have disco lights?" Pip asked. "Because whoever built this ship had a sense of humor," Riley said, using the flashing lights to mask her next maneuver. The Vex targeting systems were having trouble locking onto a ship that was apparently having a seizure while playing techno music. She dove under the dreadnought's main hull, close enough to see the individual hull plates, and fired everything they had at the ship's main reactor housing. The explosion lit up the inside of the cockpit like a small sun, and suddenly there were only 2 dreadnoughts left. "Holy nebula," Pip breathed. "You actually did it." "Don't sound so surprised," Riley said, pulling up just in time to avoid getting caught in the explosion. "I've had 8 years to think about better ways to blow up Vex ships. Turns out, the secret is to aim for the things that look important and hope they explode." The remaining fighters were scattering now, their formation completely broken. Some were trying to regroup, others were fleeing toward the remaining dreadnoughts, and at least 3 appeared to be firing at empty space because their targeting systems were still confused by the disco lights. "Pip, please tell me we still have missiles." 2 left, but one of them might be a flare. "Fire both." At this point, even a flare might confuse them. The missiles streaked toward the second dreadnought, and Riley was pleased to see that at least one of them was actually explosive. The ship's main weapons array disappeared in a flash of superheated plasma, turning a deadly war machine into a very large, very expensive piece of space junk. "One more to go," she said, turning toward the final dreadnought. "And I'm officially out of ideas that don't involve ramming." "Ramming sounds exciting," Pip said, with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he'd missed the part where ramming usually involved everyone involved dying in a spectacular fireball. Riley was about to explain why ramming was generally considered a last resort when she noticed something odd about the final dreadnought. It was turning away from the station, its engines flaring as it prepared to jump to hyperspace. "They're running," she said, not quite believing it. "Running." Pip sounded confused. "But there's still one of them, and only one of us." "Exactly," Riley said, watching the dreadnought disappear into hyperspace, with the kind of satisfaction that came from a job well done. "They just figured out that humans don't fight fair, and they don't want to stick around to see what other insane things we might do." The remaining Vex fighters were already following their command ship into hyperspace, abandoning the battle with the kind of haste that suggested they'd rather explain their failure to their superiors than try to fight an enemy who used disco lights as a tactical weapon. Riley leaned back in her pilot's seat and realized she was grinning for the first time in 8 years. The cosmic disaster limped back to the hangar with all the dignity of a wounded duck. Half the disco lights were still flashing. One engine was making a noise like a dying walrus, and there was a concerning smell coming from somewhere near the life support systems that Riley preferred not to investigate. "That was amazing," Pip said as they touched down with a landing that was only technically a crash because they stopped moving before hitting anything important. "Did you see how that dreadnought just gave up and ran away? And the disco lights, pure genius." "It wasn't genius," Riley said, shutting down systems that probably should have been shut down hours ago. "It was desperation mixed with 8 years of accumulated irritation at bad military tactics." The hangar doors opened to reveal what looked like half the station's population waiting for them. Riley could see Voss bouncing excitedly near the front, Mrs. Krell dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Blep waving all 4 arms like he was trying to signal passing spacecraft. "Oh no," Riley muttered. "They're going to want to throw a parade, aren't they?" She was right. The moment she climbed out of the cockpit, the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed through the hangar bay. Someone had apparently prepared a speech, because Voss was approaching with a tablet and the kind of expression that suggested he was about to say a lot of words about heroism and duty and other concepts that made Riley uncomfortable. "Citizens of Delta 7, Voss announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Today we witness the return of a legend. Commander Riley Martinez, the ghost of Proxima, has once again saved us from certain destruction using tactics that can only be described as brilliantly insane." Riley winced. She'd forgotten how much she hated speeches, especially speeches about her. "Can we skip the ceremony and go back to normal life? I have a coffee shop to run and these celebrations always end with someone asking me to sign things." "But you're a hero," protested a voice from the crowd. Riley recognized the Betelgeusian accountant who'd been in the coffee shop earlier. He'd apparently gotten over his fear of explosions and was now clutching what looked like an autograph pad. Heroes are overrated, Riley said. They have terrible work-life balance and their retirement plans usually involve dying gloriously in battle. I prefer making coffee. It's safer and the hours are better. But what about duty? Voss asked. What about protecting the innocent and standing against the forces of evil? Riley looked around at the faces in the crowd. Aliens from dozens of species, all of them looking at her like she was some kind of mythical creature who'd stepped out of a legend, which, she supposed, was exactly what had happened. Duty is fine, she said finally. But I did my duty for 15 years. I think I've earned the right to make terrible coffee and complain about customers who want extra foam. 3 hours later, Riley was back behind the counter at Galaxy Grounds, trying to pretend that nothing had changed. The coffee machine was still making concerning noises. Blep was still managing to violate the laws of physics while preparing simple beverages, and the morning rush was still full of beings who had no business operating complex machinery. But something was different. For one thing, there was a line stretching out the door and around the corridor, filled with aliens who wanted to meet the legendary ghost of Proxima. For another, her boss had given her a raise and a promotion to senior interstellar beverage specialist, which came with a certificate that was misspelled in 3 languages. One large nebula blend, said her first customer of the day, a young Rigelian pilot who was staring at her with the kind of awe usually reserved for religious figures. And could you maybe tell me about that maneuver where you flew under the dreadnought? I'm taking advanced pilot training and that move isn't in any of the textbooks. Riley sighed and started grinding coffee beans that would probably taste like engine coolant. It's not in the textbooks because it's a terrible idea that only works if your enemies are too confused to shoot straight. But how did you know they'd be confused? Because I've been fighting Vex for 15 years and they've never learned to adapt to opponents who don't follow their rulebook. Riley handed over the coffee and immediately started on the next order. The key to beating a superior enemy is to do things so stupid that their tactical computers can't process them. Could you teach me? Riley looked at the young pilot, then at the line of aliens stretching around the corridor, all of them waiting to ask her the same question. She could see Pip near the back of the line, apparently having decided that working in a coffee shop was more exciting than whatever the Flarian Defense Corps had planned for him. Maybe, she said finally. But I charge extra for flying lessons, and they come with a guarantee that you'll either become a better pilot or develop a healthy respect for staying on the ground. By the end of the day, Riley had signed more autographs than she'd signed in her entire military career, answered more questions about space combat than she'd answered at her official debriefings, and somehow managed to serve coffee to half the station without anyone complaining about the taste. She was wiping down the counter when Mrs. Krell approached, her usual cup of tea in hand. So, the elderly Centaurian said with a knowing smile, how does it feel to be a hero again? Riley considered the question while she cleaned coffee stains that would probably never come out completely. Outside the viewport, space was peaceful and quiet, with no sign of hostile aliens or impending doom. Inside the coffee shop, everything was exactly as it had been that morning, except for the small pile of requests for flying lessons and the certificate on the wall that proclaimed her a senior beverage specialist. You know what? She said finally. Retirement is overrated. Turns out, making terrible coffee and occasionally saving the galaxy isn't the worst career combination. At least now when people complain about my coffee, I can threaten to fight off alien invasions until they apologize. Mrs. Krell laughed. And the flying lessons. Riley looked at the list of names Pip had compiled, all of them young pilots eager to learn the kind of tactics that weren't taught in military academies. Well, she said. Someone has to teach them that the best way to win a fight is to confuse your enemies into surrendering. Might as well be me. She hung up her apron and looked around the coffee shop one last time. Tomorrow there would be more terrible coffee to make, more aliens to serve, and probably more young pilots to teach that sometimes the most effective military tactic was to do something so ridiculous that your enemies gave up trying to understand it. Riley Martinez, former commander, current barista, and part-time flight instructor, decided that retirement really was overrated, especially when it came with a raise.